Dae-Hyun lived by a singular cold truth. In the Seoul underworld, love isn't a luxury, it's a target. He had spent 10 years turning his heart into a fortress of ice, ruling the Hanayong estate with a hand that never shook. But tonight, the ice didn't just crack, it shattered. And it started with the one thing a man like him should never have allowed inside his walls. A baby's laughter. Imani was a ghost. To the security teams, she was just the woman who made the marble floors shine. They didn't see the fear in her eyes, or the way she held her breath every time a guard walked past her trolley. She had done this calculation 100 times on the bus ride over. The night sitter gone, the backup not answering, the eviction notice on her apartment door very much still there. And this job, the West Wing night shift, the one that paid enough to matter starting in 40 minutes. So she had packed Zola into the laundry trolley, beneath a pile of white silk sheets, and she had walked through the staff entrance the same way she always did, head down, steady hands, breathing like nothing in the world was wrong. Just a few more hours, Zola. Stay quiet for Mama. Just a few more hours and we can go home. Zola, wide-eyed and unbothered, stared up at her from inside the sheets like this was the most interesting thing that had ever happened. Home was a cold apartment with an eviction notice on the door. This job cleaning the West Wing was her only lifeline. But the West Wing had one rule. Never enter the master study after 8 p.m. It wasn't written anywhere. It didn't need to be. You learned it the way you learned everything in the Hanayong estate, from the silence of the people who had been there long enough to know, and the absence of the ones who hadn't. Because after 8 p.m., Dae-Hyun wasn't a businessman. He was a predator. And Imani had just wheeled his next problem through the front door. It took exactly 4 seconds for Imani's world to end. 4 seconds of turning to grab a fresh cloth. 4 seconds of looking away. And when she looked back, the trolley flap was open, the sheets were disturbed, and the space underneath them was empty. Zola was gone. The hallway didn't change. The marble still gleamed. The sconces still burned their low amber. But the silence of that corridor landed on Imani like something physical, like a hand pressing down on her chest, stealing the air before she could use it. She checked behind the velvet curtains. Nothing. She checked the alcove by the service door. Nothing. She was moving fast now. Faster than she'd allowed herself to move in this building. Faster than a ghost was supposed to move, and then she saw it. A single, tiny handprint on the glass of the elevator door. Smeared low. The height of a child who had just learned to pull herself upright. She looked up at the gold display above the elevator. The penthouse. Dae-Hyun's private sanctum. A place where even his top lieutenants didn't tread without an invitation. A place that existed in the minds of everyone who worked the Hanayong estate, less as a floor and more as a warning. Imani knew that if she stepped into that elevator, she might not come back out. She pressed the button without hesitating. The doors opened to silence, the kind of silence that has weight thick with cigar smoke and old leather and the particular stillness of a room that is used to keeping secrets. The penthouse was dim, lit only by the city bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Rain on the glass. Seoul 40 floors below, indifferent and glittering. Imani stepped out. She stood very still and listened. And then she heard a sound that stopped her heart completely. Not a scream. Not a cry. A giggle. Small, bright, utterly unconcerned with the gravity of its surroundings coming from behind the double oak doors of the study. The doors that, according to every unspoken rule of this building, separated the world from whatever Dae-Hyun became after 8 p.m. Imani crossed the room, put her hand on the door, pushed it open. And the sight that met her eyes was something she would never, for the rest of her life, be able to fully explain to anyone who wasn't standing in that doorway. Imani stopped breathing. There, on the desk that had signed off on the takeover of half the city's docks, sat Zola, both fists planted on the leather surface for balance, back straight with the particular dignity of a child who has only recently discovered verticality and intends to use it. She wasn't crying. She wasn't scared. She was busy trying to fit a priceless 200-year-old jade seal into her mouth. And across from her, on the other side of that ancient dark wood, sat Dae-Hyun. Jacket off, sleeves rolled to the forearm, where the tail of a dragon tattoo wound upward and disappeared. A man built from a decade of cold decisions in colder rooms. His monitors cast blue light across his face. His hands, scarred and still, were flat on the desk. He wasn't moving. He looked like a statue carved from granite eyes fixed on the small child in front of him. Expression caught somewhere between horror and a confusion so complete it had bypassed language entirely. Dae-Hyun had faced down assassins without blinking. He had survived 3 attempts on his life before he was 30. He had sat across from men who wanted him dead and eaten his meal without tasting it. He had built an empire on the precise understanding that every living thing in Seoul had a price or a pressure point, and he had learned both for every person who mattered. But this? A 10-pound human in a diaper, drooling on his ledger? This was the only thing in the world he didn't know how to kill or buy. Zola looked up from the jade seal, found his eyes, considered him with the profound, unimpressed seriousness that only infants and very old judges can produce. Then she held the seal out toward him, offering it, generous and unhurried. Dae-Hyun did not take it. He did not move at all. Imani stood in the doorway, hand still on the door, and understood with absolute clarity that she was looking at the most dangerous man in Seoul, completely, entirely, at the mercy of a 10-month-old who hadn't yet learned the word for fear. Zola dropped the jade seal. It landed on the desk with a heavy thud that rang through the silence of the study. She watched it for half a second, satisfied, apparently, with the sound, and then her attention moved on with the swift, merciless efficiency of someone who has never once been bored. Her hand found his tie, the silk one, the one that cost more than Imani's monthly rent. Small fingers closed around it and pulled, hard. Dae-Hyun's chin dipped forward an inch. He looked down at the hand, then at the face behind it. His voice, when it came, was low, the kind of low that came not from softness, but from a man unused to raising it. "You are very brave, or very, very lost." Imani stepped forward. She could feel her hands shaking and couldn't stop them. Her shadow crossed the desk, a small, trembling line against the weight of everything in that room. "Please, sir. I'll take her. I'll go. I'll never come back. Please don't hurt her." She expected him to roar. She expected the door to crash open behind her, guards flooding in, hands on her arms, the end of everything she'd been holding together by threads for the past 6 months. But Dae-Hyun didn't look at Imani. He looked at the fingers wrapped around his tie. Tiny, certain, completely unaware that they were gripping the collar of the most feared man in 3 districts and that this was supposed to mean something. He felt a warmth he hadn't felt in a decade. Not fire. Not the heat of a threat or a room about to turn violent. Something older than any of that. Something that had no name in the vocabulary he'd spent 10 years building. A simple, uncomplicated touch. Slowly, carefully, the way a man moves when he is afraid of breaking something he doesn't understand, Dae-Hyun reached out. He didn't pull his tie away. Instead, one finger extended, found the tip of Zola's nose. Boop. The giggle that came out of her was enormous for a person her size. Loud and bubbly and completely without self-consciousness, bouncing off the monitors and the dark bookshelves and the walls that had absorbed 10 years of low, dangerous conversation. It filled every corner of the room at once. Dae-Hyun sat back. The disbelief in his eyes shifted into something he didn't have a word for either. It wasn't just that a baby was in his office. It was that the baby wasn't afraid of him. To the world outside these walls, he was the monster of Hanayong, a name spoken carefully and never twice in the same breath. To Zola, he was just a giant with a shiny gold tie and an interesting nose. She reached for him again, fingers open, asking for more. The red light hit the desk console like a slap. One pulse, then another. The monitors shifted all of them, simultaneously to the front gates. Black SUVs in a line, engines running. Men moving with the particular purpose of people who have been told exactly where to go and what to do when they get there. This wasn't a routine check. Dae-Hyun's face closed like a door. He turned to Imani. The warmth was gone. The voice that came out was the one the city knew, flat and cold and leaving no room for interpretation. Stay quiet. If you want her to live, stay behind that desk. Do not make a sound. Imani moved. She took Zola from the desk and pressed herself into the shadow behind it, her back against the wood, her daughter's face tucked against her neck. Dae-Hyun stood, rolled his sleeve down, reached for his jacket. The ghost and the predator were no longer alone. The world was coming for Dae-Hyun, the same world that always came eventually, the one built on old grudges and power that needed to be taken because it couldn't be earned. But for the first time in 10 years, he wasn't just fighting for his throne. He was fighting for the tiny hand that had refused, even now, to let go of his collar. Dae-Hyun knew the sound of a betrayal before it even reached his door. It wasn't the SUVs. It wasn't the tactical gear or the cut power or the mechanical groan of the shutters descending over the windows. It was something older than any of that, a frequency he had learned to read the way other men read weather, the particular quality of silence that preceded a storm that had been planned. Someone inside had opened the gates. The estate was no longer a palace. It was a target. And for the first time in 10 years of sitting behind that desk, Dae-Hyun felt the weight of something beyond his own survival, pressing against his chest. He swept the documents into the drawer with one hand, reached for Zola with the other, lifted her with a gentleness that had no business existing in those hands, quiet and sure, like a man who had done this before, or maybe like a man who understood, in some wordless place, that this was how you were supposed to hold something that could break. He turned to Imani. His voice left no space for hesitation. The elevator is dead. They've cut the power. If you stay here, you're a witness. If you follow me, you're a ghost. Choose. Now. He pressed a panel behind the bookshelf. The wall moved seamless, soundless opening into a room of cold steel and glowing servers. 6 feet by 6 feet. Filtered air. The smell of ozone and concrete, and the particular stillness of a space designed to outlast everything outside it. Imani crossed the threshold just as the heavy oak doors of the study crashed open behind her. The hidden door sealed shut without a sound. The safe room had been built to survive a war. It had not been built with a 10-month-old in mind. Imani stood against the steel wall and watched the most feared man in Seoul sit down on a crate of emergency supplies, her daughter still in his arms, the shouting outside bleeding faintly through the vents. Dae-Hyun sat straight-backed and still, his eyes on the door, his expression doing the math distance, time, variables, exits. Then he felt it. Zola's lower lip had found its way out. The sounds were reaching her now, the mechanical noise, the shouting, the particular chaos of a world that had nothing to do with her and no interest in being quiet about it. Her face was doing the slow, terrible preparation of a child about to express herself fully and without restraint. Dae-Hyun looked down. Imani looked at him. Both of them understood the problem at exactly the same moment. Silence was their only weapon. The men outside were running thermal sensors through the vent's standard sweep for a target who knew how to disappear. Sound carried differently in steel rooms. A cry, even muffled, even small, would be enough. The men outside were looking for a king. They were not expecting to find a mother, a child, and a monster sitting in the dark together, all three of them holding their breath. Zola's lip trembled. Her eyes went glassy. The first sound was already building somewhere in her chest, small and devastating and entirely beyond negotiation. Dae-Hyun looked at her. Then, slowly, he did the only thing he could think of. He brought her closer, not at arm's length this time, not held out like a problem to be assessed, but against his chest. One large hand spread flat against her back. He didn't rock her. He didn't speak. He simply held her with the absolute, unshakable stillness that had kept him alive in rooms far more dangerous than this one. And for reasons that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with something older than either of them, Zola went quiet. She pressed her face into the lapel of his shirt. Her fist found his collar, and she held on. Outside, the footsteps moved through the study, past the desk, past the bookshelves, past the wall. Inside, nobody breathed. The Don's Library. Subscribe. New stories. Every week. Now back to Dae-Hyun. Zola had been patient long enough. The cry that came out of her was sharp and complete, the kind that cuts through steel and silence and every careful calculation a man has made about his own survival. Imani lurched forward, arms out, the instinct older than thought. Dae-Hyun didn't hand her over. Instead, his hand went to his pocket, slow, deliberate. He produced a pocket watch, heavy, gold-plated, the surface worn smooth in the places a thumb returns to without thinking. He clicked it open. A melody came out, delicate, haunting, a sound so out of place in that steel tomb that Imani forgot to breathe. The notes were small and precise, turned out by tiny gold gears that caught the blue glow of the servers and threw it back in fragments. An old song, the kind that belongs to a specific pair of hands and a specific room that no longer exists. Zola stopped mid-cry. Her mouth stayed open for a moment, the sound simply abandoned, mid-flight, no longer necessary. Her eyes found the watch, found the gears, widened with the total, consuming attention that infants reserve for things that are genuinely, unexpectedly beautiful. She reached for it. The light from the watch moved across Dae-Hyun's face. The monster was gone, not hidden, gone. What sat in its place was something that had no business surviving 10 years in the Seoul underworld and somehow had anyway, pressed down beneath everything the city had required of him. Imani saw it the way you see a thing you weren't meant to see, quickly, clearly, with the understanding that it would not last. The boy he used to be, before the city broke him and he decided to become something the city would fear instead. Her voice came out barely above a breath. You're not what they say you are. Dae-Hyun didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on Zola, on the small fingers now tracing the edge of the watch case with total concentration. I am exactly what they say I am, Imani. A beat. The melody turned through its final notes and began again. But even a monster knows when he's found something worth more than his throne. The thud that hit the wall came from somewhere deep in the steel, not a knock, not a test, a battering ram. Methodical. The kind of patience that belongs to men who have been told the door will open eventually and have decided to believe it. The safe room groaned, a sound like the building reconsidering itself. Dae-Hyun's eyes cut to the security feed. His expression didn't change, not exactly, but something behind it did. Something that moved through his face the way a fault line moves invisible until it isn't. He looked at the feed for a long time. Then, quietly, with the stillness of a man absorbing information he had already on some level known was coming. The men outside weren't rivals. They weren't a competing faction. They weren't the external threat he had spent a decade preparing for, the one he had built walls and protocols and a room of cold steel specifically to survive. They were his own guards. The betrayal wasn't at the gate. It was already inside. The security monitor flickered. Min's face filled the screen. 7 years of standing 2 steps behind Dae-Hyun through negotiations that ended badly, through rooms that needed to be cleaned afterward, through every decision that required a witness who would never speak. 7 years of knowing exactly where the walls were, exactly where the doors were, exactly which debts were still outstanding and which wounds had never fully closed. He wasn't wearing his earpiece. He wasn't standing at attention. He was looking directly into the camera with the particular ease of a man who has spent years waiting for a moment and has finally arrived inside it. He smiled. His voice came through the intercom flat and unhurried, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this and found the rehearsal sufficient. Dae-Hyun, open the door. We only want the girl and the child. Hand them over, and you keep your title. Refuse, and we burn the entire estate with you inside. The safe room held the words for a moment after he finished. Imani's face had gone pale, but her arms hadn't moved. Her grip on Zola was the grip of someone who has already decided the only thing that matters in this room and arranged everything else accordingly. She watched Dae-Hyun. He was looking at the monitor. Then at his weapon, heavy, black, pulled from the drawer with the muscle memory of a decade. He held it for a moment, turned it over once. Then he set it down. His eyes moved to the music box, still sitting on the supply crate where he had left it, still turning. The melody had looped so many times in the last few minutes that it had stopped being sound and started being something else, the particular frequency of a thing that survives everything around it simply by being too small to destroy. He looked at Imani's hands. He had looked at 1,000 pairs of hands across 1,000 desks and tables and the kind of rooms that don't appear on any floor plan. He knew what hands looked like when they belonged to someone dangerous, and he knew what they looked like when they belonged to someone pretending. He had built his entire life on that distinction. Imani's hands were cracked at the knuckles, faintly chemical-stained at the fingertips. The hands of someone who had spent years making other people's spaces clean and come home to a cold apartment and done it again the next morning without being asked to be brave about it. She had walked into this building tonight with no weapons and no guards and a baby hidden in a laundry trolley, powered entirely by the specific, undefeatable determination of someone who has run out of other options. He had led armies of men who didn't come close. There is a ventilation shaft behind the server rack. It leads to the service garage. You take Zola, and you run. Do not stop until you reach the main road. Imani stared at him. What about you? They'll kill you. Dae-Hyun looked at her for a moment, not the way he looked at problems, not the way he looked at people who needed managing. Directly, cleanly. The way a man looks when he has stopped performing and doesn't have enough time left to start again. They can't kill a man who has finally found a reason to live. He moved the server rack himself. The shaft behind it was narrow and dark, and dropped at an angle toward the service levels. He helped her in. Then he lifted Zola carefully, the same practiced gentleness as before, as if his hands had already learned the weight of her and didn't intend to forget it. He passed her through. Zola's fingers found his thumb, closed around it with the absolute, unconditional certainty of someone who has decided this hand is safe and sees no reason to revisit the decision. He stayed still for a moment. Then, gently, he detached her hand finger by finger, pressed her palm flat once against his own, closed the grate. He stood up, turned to the vault door, put his hand on the manual release, pulled it. The steel door hissed open and the study received him dark and wrecked, the shutters bent, the windows shattered, Seoul glittering cold and indifferent 40 floors below. He walked to the center of the room and stopped. His hands were empty. His jacket was straight. 6 red laser dots found his chest before he had finished exhaling. Min came through the door with his men fanned out behind him, weapons leveled, moving with the efficiency of people who had planned this room, and this moment, and this man specifically. Dae-Hyun stood perfectly still. Where are they? The voice that came back was the one the city knew. Cold, settled. The voice of a man who has already decided how this ends and found the decision acceptable. They are gone, Min. And so is your leverage. A beat. The laser dots didn't move. Now let's see how well you lead when there's no one left to fear you. The explosion hit the lower levels like a held breath finally released a deep, structural roar that moved up through the building's bones before the sound arrived. The thermal purge. Every server in that room, every drive, every record of every transaction and every name and every debt that had taken 10 years to accumulate, gone in a wall of fire that sealed the service corridor behind Imani, like a door closing on a life she was done with. The study filled with light from below, orange and violent, climbing the windows, turning Seoul's cold diamonds briefly, furiously warm. Dae-Hyun stood in the middle of it all, still, empty-handed, exactly where he had chosen to be. Imani waited for the sirens. She sat on the stone bench at the edge of the private garden as Seoul turned from black to gray to the pale, uncertain lavender of early morning. Zola was asleep against her chest, heavy and warm, unbothered by the soot on her mother's clothes, or the smell of smoke still sitting in the air, or the fact that the world had very nearly ended last night and hadn't, for reasons Imani was still trying to understand. She had no money, no home to go back to, no plan beyond this bench and this morning and the small, sleeping weight that was the only thing she was certain of. She had expected to be cast back into the shadows. It was where the world had always eventually returned her, After every effort, every careful step, every shift she had worked without complaint, and every rule she had followed, and the one she had broken, the shadows were patient. They always waited. She heard the car before she saw it. The door opened slowly. Dae-Hyun stepped out, one arm in a sling, a bandage along his jaw, his face bruised in the specific pattern of a man who had absorbed something that was meant to finish him and had declined. He walked toward her across the garden path, not the walk of the Hanayong estate, not the walk of a man who owns every room he enters. The walk of someone who has put something down that he had been carrying for a very long time and is still adjusting to the absence of the weight. He stopped a few feet away, looked at Zola, then at Imani. The vent was narrow. I wasn't sure you'd make it. Imani looked at him for a long moment. You stayed behind. Why? He didn't answer immediately. He looked out over the garden, the city beyond the walls, beginning to wake, indifferent as always, already moving on to the next thing. Then he sat down on the bench beside her, leaving a careful distance between them, and reached into his pocket. The music box was charred along one side. The gold had darkened where the heat had found it, the surface no longer smooth in the way that comes from decades of handling, but rough in the new way that comes from surviving something it wasn't built to survive. He clicked it open. The melody came out clear and sweet, and completely unchanged, turning through the same notes it had always turned through, the same ones his mother's hands had wound it to play, the same ones that had stopped Zola mid-cry in a steel room while the walls groaned around them. Imani looked at it, then at him. He didn't talk about the coup, didn't talk about Min or the men who had been removed or the particular mathematics of a betrayal that had been 7 years in the planning and 40 minutes in the execution. He didn't talk about the throne or the title or any of the machinery of power that had defined every conversation he'd had in this estate for a decade. He talked about the sound of Zola's laughter in a room built for secrets. He talked about the way it had moved through the steel and the servers and the filtered air and found him anyway, found something in him that the city had spent 10 years trying to convince him wasn't there anymore. The monster of Hanayong had died in that safe room. He understood that now. Not killed not by Min or the battering ram or the 6 red dots on his chest. Just quietly, finally, rendered unnecessary by a 10-month-old who had looked at him without fear and found nothing monstrous to confirm. Something else had taken its place. He was still learning its shape. The estate needs more than a cleaner, Imani. He looked at her directly. Not assessing, not calculating. The way he had looked at her in the safe room, in the last honest moment before everything broke open. It needs a soul. My mother told me once that a house is just a cage until a child's voice fills the halls. I want you to stay, not as staff, as the manager of this house. My ward. Imani held his gaze. It wasn't a proposal of marriage. It wasn't sentiment dressed up as strategy. It was something rarer than either a man who had spent 10 years building walls handing someone the key not because he had to, but because he had looked at what he'd built and understood. Finally, what was missing from it? He was offering her a fortress, the one thing the world had always found reasons to deny her. A month later, the study was unrecognizable in the best way. The desk was still there, ancient, dark, immovable, signed into the floor by decades of consequence. The monitors still ran. The calls still happened. The sharp suit and the cold eyes still appeared on screens across the city, and the men on the other end of those calls still chose their words carefully and meant what they said. But on the floor beside the desk, pressed against the mahogany like it had always belonged there, was a small, colorful playmat. And under the desk, sitting on a pair of very expensive shoes with the focused satisfaction of someone who has claimed territory and intends to hold it, Zola worked through a set of plastic keys with the same total seriousness she had once applied to a jade seal. Dae-Hyun sat above her on his high-stakes call, looking stern, looking impenetrable, looking precisely like the man's soul had always believed him to be. His foot moved slightly, rocking her. People still whispered about him. They said he had become more dangerous, that a man with something to lose fights differently than a man with nothing, and they weren't wrong. They saw the suits and the cold eyes and the way a room still changed when he entered it. What they didn't see was the pink light-up sneaker sitting on the bookshelf, tucked between the ancient jade seals and the charred music box, right where anyone who knew where to look could find it. Still blinking, faintly, in the dark. Imani came into the frame with a tray. She set it on the edge of the desk without interrupting the call. Dae-Hyun's eyes moved to her for exactly 1 second, a look that carried everything the room had witnessed and survived, a look that required no translation. She looked back. The same. In the end, it wasn't a war that changed the underworld of Seoul. It wasn't a betrayal or a coup or a thermal purge or any of the machinery of power that the city had been running on for decades. It was something smaller. Something that didn't know the rules and therefore couldn't be stopped by them. A 10-pound human who had crawled out of a laundry trolley and into the most fortified room in the building and looked at the most feared man in 3 districts and seen nothing worth being afraid of. Because even the coldest heart can't stay frozen when a baby holds on tight. And Zola had never once let go. That's the Dawn's library. Every week, a new story, a new world, a new man tested beyond what he thought he could survive. If you want to know what happens when the Dawn's enemies come back for round 2, subscribe and stay close. The next chapter drops soon.